The hum of early morning routine filled JFK's Terminal 4. Coffee cups clinked, rollaboards rumbled across the tile, and the mechanical voice overhead read off destinations like a metronome of modern travel. But for Marcus Ellison, a man whose entire career had been built on calm under pressure, this was the morning the script would flip. Dressed in a slate-gray custom suit, Marcus walked with quiet purpose toward Gate 17. He wasn't just another businessman in the sea of suits. He was the CEO of Ellison Provisions, a rising titan in sustainable food logistics. His company had recently secured a landmark $48 million deal with Aerovista Airlines, revolutionizing their in-flight catering across the Western Seaboard. Today, he was en route to San Francisco to speak at the Western Sustainability and Agriculture Summit. But fate had a different agenda. In one hand, he carried a timeless leather garment bag. In the other, a crisp first-class boarding pass. He had flown thousands of times before, smooth, uneventful, routine. But this time, the air around Gate 17 felt different. The young gate agent's eyes flickered uneasily as Marcus handed over his pass. Her fingers hovered over the scanner, her jaw tightening slightly. "Can I see a second form of ID, please?" she asked, her tone polite but strained. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Is there an issue with my boarding pass?" She hesitated. "Just extra verification, sir." There was no explicit accusation, no overt rudeness. But the pause, the glance, the unspoken doubt, it was all there. Marcus, a man raised to recognize microaggressions as quickly as business opportunities, understood this dance too well. Without a change in his tone, he reached into his wallet and handed her his driver's license. Still, the uncertainty lingered. Moments later, a security officer appeared, summoned quietly. His expression was blank, but his posture was not. To the average traveler, this might have seemed like an unfortunate delay. To Marcus, it was the beginning of something all too familiar and entirely unacceptable. He took a breath. Then, with the patience of a man used to navigating boardrooms filled with egos and contracts worth millions, Marcus stepped back from the boarding line, withdrew his phone, and made a single call. "Rebecca," he said, his voice calm, "I need you to forward the signed Aerovista contract to my inbox. Right now." Rebecca Hayes, his longtime executive assistant, knew better than to ask questions. Within minutes, a 72-page agreement bearing the airline's letterhead and Marcus' signature sat on his phone. And with that, he walked quietly to a nearby seating area, opened his email, and waited. Across the gate area, murmurs began to rise. Passengers looked on, confused. A man in a blazer leaned toward his colleague. "What's going on? Did that guy get flagged or something?" The security officer whispered something to the gate agent. Another staff member appeared, then another. From hushed conversations emerged one realization. Someone had made a serious mistake. Unbeknownst to most of them, the man they were delaying, Marcus Ellison, was not just a high-profile passenger. He was a strategic partner, a top-tier supplier, a keynote speaker. And as one senior gate supervisor finally recalled, the name on that contract matched the one now calmly reviewing emails in a corner seat of Gate 17. Back at Aerovista's regional operations office, alarms had already been raised. Within 20 minutes, Helena Stratton, the airline's regional executive director, arrived at the gate personally, her blazer crisp, her face taut with apology. She approached Marcus, extending her hand. "Mr. Ellison, I want to sincerely apologize. This never should have happened." Marcus looked up, slowly closed his laptop, and met her eyes. Then, without a word, he pulled out a physical copy of the contract, carefully folded and stored in the front pocket of his garment bag, and placed it on the table beside him. "This is who I am," he said simply. "Not a threat, not a risk, just a partner." Helena's expression shifted. She nodded once, gravely. "This situation will be addressed immediately." Marcus nodded back, but didn't move. The gate agent, now red-faced and visibly shaken, stood a few feet away. She didn't speak. The symbolism was not lost on anyone watching. A man whose identity had been questioned was now holding the very document that defined his professional value to the very institution that had doubted him. Born and raised in Mansfield, Ohio, Marcus never forgot the lessons his parents instilled in him. His mother, a grocery store manager, taught him that food connects dignity to every family's table. His father, who worked the mill graveyard shift for 30 years, taught him that hard work beats even the deepest prejudice eventually. Marcus had never needed to shout to be heard. His strategy was always clear. Let your actions do the talking. Let your calm be the storm. What began as a silent slight evolved into something far more meaningful. By the time he reapproached the boarding lane, everything had changed. Staff moved quickly now, eyes downcast, offering polite, reverent gestures. A flight attendant stepped forward to personally escort him on board, taking his garment bag with 2 hands as if it were sacred. He was seated before any other passenger. The crew's behavior was impeccable not just by protocol, but by spirit. Apologies were whispered quietly, and the air no longer felt sterile, felt human. Across the airline, from senior boardrooms to staff break rooms, a rapid internal review began. Phone recordings were pulled. Training manuals reread. Legal and public relations teams huddled to form a response. And most importantly, a single question echoed across departments. How did this happen? What Marcus Ellison had sparked with a single phone call was now a full-blown reckoning. Aerovista executives committed to systemic reforms. They launched new bias training protocols, revamped gate-level procedures, and perhaps most significantly opened dialogue with civil rights organizations to rebuild credibility. Marcus had never raised his voice, never threatened, never dramatized. His power came from dignity. And in doing so, he offered Aerovista something they hadn't asked for, but desperately needed, a second chance to get it right. In the days that followed, headlines whispered about the incident, but it was Marcus' composure that took center stage. For Aerovista, this was no longer about one gate agent or one decision. It became about culture, about the invisible lines drawn around who looks like they belong and who doesn't. And in that quiet cabin, as the plane taxied toward the sky, Marcus sat back in his seat, not victorious, not smug, just steady. He wasn't thinking about retribution. He was thinking about his next speech and how he'd begin it. Sometimes the simplest act of being seen can change the course of everything. Because on that morning, at Gate 17, one man had rewritten the rules not with fury, but with grace. And in doing so, he left behind more than just a corrected injustice. He left a legacy. In the weeks following the incident, Marcus Ellison's name began to echo far beyond JFK Terminal 4. It wasn't about fame. Marcus never chased headlines. But journalists, civil rights advocates, and corporate reformers alike found themselves drawn to the elegance of what had transpired. It wasn't just that he'd been wrong at it was the way he had responded that turned heads. He didn't post a video. He didn't lodge a public complaint. He didn't walk away. Instead, he had stood his ground not by raising his voice, but by elevating the conversation. Soon after his flight landed in San Francisco, the first phone call came from an executive at Aerovista's headquarters. A formal apology, yes, but also an invitation. They asked Marcus if he would be willing to consult on a new initiative, a corporate equity review task force. Marcus was hesitant, not because he didn't care, but because he wasn't interested in being their fix-it mascot. But after a long walk along the Embarcadero that evening, he called back and agreed on one condition. "I'll help," he said, "but this can't be about image control. This has to be real, and it has to start at the top." 2 weeks later, he stood before Aerovista's entire senior leadership team at their Dallas headquarters. Gone was the tailored suede that wore a simple dark sweater and spoke without slides or jargon. The room was quiet as he told the story of Gate 17, not as a cautionary tale, but as a mirror. "You didn't fail because someone didn't recognize me," he said. "You fail because your culture trained her not to." That statement landed like a weight. And from that moment, things began to shift. Within 90 days, Aerovista launched a program called Clear Skies, an internal cultural overhaul aimed at addressing not just racial bias, but all forms of exclusion in their workforce. Marcus sat as a non-voting advisory chair, insisting his role remain independent, objective, and focused on results, not performance. But the impact didn't stop at Aerovista. Other airlines took notice. Several major carriers reached out privately to discuss their own review processes. And quietly, Marcus became an informal advisor not because he sought to, but because leadership, when demonstrated authentically, tends to draw others toward it. Meanwhile, back home in Ohio, things felt different. His mother, now retired, had seen the news clips, even if they never used his name directly. "I saw something about a man at the airport who stood his ground," she told him one night over the phone. "He reminded me of your father." Marcus paused. His father had passed 2 years earlier, never one for speeches, but always a man of deep principle. If he could have seen what happened at Gate 17, Marcus thought, he would have simply nodded and said, "Good. You didn't fold." Back in the industry, something else happened, something Marcus didn't expect. Applications for mid-level and senior positions at Ellison Provisions began to skyrocket, especially from professionals of color. In interviews, many referenced the airport story without even knowing the full details. They simply said, "We heard how you lead." One candidate, a young Latina supply chain analyst, said it best, "I want to work somewhere where being excellent doesn't have to be proven twice." That stuck with him. So Marcus did something he hadn't planned. He expanded the internship program at his company, dedicating a quarter of all incoming slots to first-generation college students from underserved communities. The program didn't have a name, just an intentiento, give someone else a seat at the table without having to justify why they deserve to be there. Months passed, but the effects of that moment at Gate 17 never really faded. In training seminars across the country, staff members rewatched the security footage of that day not because of any dramatic confrontation, but to study what not to do. To understand how unconscious behavior, even when polite, can still degrade dignity. And Marcus? He kept flying, quietly, often in first class, sometimes in coach. Not because of status, but because it didn't matter anymore. He knew who he was. Once, months later, while waiting for a flight in Dallas, a senior flight attendant approached him quietly with a cup of tea. "We haven't met," she said, "but I want you to know that after your experience, we started looking each passenger in the eye again." "Really looking?" He smiled, nodded, and accepted the tea. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during a leadership retreat Marcus was invited to attend in Vermont. It was a gathering of executives, CEOs, nonprofit heads, each of them invited to share one story of leadership that had changed them. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus stood up, took a breath, and told the story of Gate 17, not for the first time, but this time differently. "I didn't make that call to prove a point," he said. "I made it to protect the years of work, the lives of my employees, the reputation of my company. But I also made it because I needed someone in that momentaneity remember that dignity is not optional. It's not a luxury. It's the foundation." The room was silent for a long time after that. He ended the speech the same way he ended that phone call to Rebecca months before. "Send the contract. Let the facts speak." And that was Marcus Ellison's legacy, not just as a CEO, not just as a man who confronted bias at an airport, but as a quiet architect of respect. A reminder that systems don't change because of noise. They change because someone chose to act calmly, firmly, and without apology. At Gate 17, the world didn't see a protest or a scandal. They saw a man stand still and change the altitude of the entire room. And sometimes, that's all it takes.